For more on the war in Ukraine, David Martin joins us now from the Pentagon. David, of course, is CBS News' national security correspondent. So, David, what was the gist of President Putin's speech today as the Russians celebrated their Victory Day?
Well, basically, he tried to link the victory in 1945 of Russia over the Nazis of Germany to the current war in Ukraine by basically calling the current leaders of Ukraine Nazis, which, to put it mildly, is outlandish, as was another claim he made in that speech, which is that he had to invade Ukraine because Ukraine was about to get nuclear weapons. But I think what's important about that speech is not what he said, but what he didn't say. He didn't say that Russia was declaring war on Ukraine. Remember, it's still, quote unquote, a special military operation. And he didn't announce a vast mobilization of legions of troops to fight in Ukraine. So he really didn't raise the stakes any with this speech. But by the same token, he didn't lower them either. He didn't give any sign that he's backing off of his intention to seize a good part of eastern Ukraine.
When you joined this program last week, you talked about some of the intelligence being shared between the Americans and the Ukrainians. And there have been reports of the president telling top security officials to cut that out. What can you tell us about that?
Well, what he's saying to cut out is not sharing the intelligence with Ukraine, but to cut out talking about it to reporters. The two reports in question are one that the U.S. was giving Ukraine intelligence that allowed them to locate Russian generals and kill them, and two, the U.S. was giving Ukraine intelligence that allowed the Ukrainians to locate that cruiser Moskva and sink it. I doubt that either of those reports came as a great revelation to an old intelligence pro like Vladimir Putin. But when U.S. officials started talking to reporters about it, they were telling the rest of the world about it, and it was adding insult to injury, as if they were deliberately rubbing Putin's nose in the fact that they could do this and get away with it. And of course, the concern here all along has been that the U.S. will do something that provokes Russia, provokes Putin specifically, into escalating this war, either by resorting to attacks against the West or resorting to the use of chemical or nuclear weapons.
You and I watched as President Biden signed the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act Monday. Not the first time we've heard of a Lend-Lease Act in American or world history, but walk us through what this one means, what this means for the Ukrainians.
Well, it's basically a symbolic show of support for Ukraine. The original Lend-Lease Act, of course, was enacted just before the United States entered World War II, and it allowed the U.S. to lend or lease military equipment to both Britain and, ironically, to the predecessor of Russia, the Soviet Union, who at the time was an ally of the United States. But the U.S. does not need Lend-Lease in order to support Ukraine in this war. It's using something called Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows it to take weapons out of its own stockpiles and just ship them directly to Ukraine. So far, it has committed something like $3.8 billion just since the invasion of Ukraine, $3.8 billion in weapons to Ukraine. But it's down to its last $100 million. And so that is why the president has asked Congress for another $33 billion in supplemental spending. And the Pentagon said today that as long as it gets that supplemental by the third week in May, there'll be no interruption or slowdown in the flow of weapons to Ukraine.
The United States has also been training Ukrainian soldiers, providing defensive and offensive arms to their military, which the Russians are targeting, and also funneling billions of dollars in aid to the Zelensky government. This feels, by definition, like a proxy war.
This is a proxy war. The U.S. has entered the war on the side of Ukraine, but it's not doing any of the actual fighting. It's giving Ukraine intelligence that helps kill Russians. It's giving Ukraine weapons that helps kill Russians. It's giving Ukraine training that helps kill Russians. By any definition, that is a proxy war, and the goal of U.S. policy here is to keep it just that, a proxy war, not a real war between the U.S. and Russia.
David Martin, we thank you for the time. Thanks for joining us.
Sure.